Walt Disney World has over 25 hotels on property, and when you visit the resort today, it all looks perfectly planned and complete. Many of those hotels were built through the late 1980s and early 90s, when the company and leadership were eager to build out capacity in a creative and tasteful way. The result, in my opinion, was the creation of some of the greatest themed hotels in the world, and was the culmination of a unique collaboration between Disney's imaginative expertise and some of the world's most famous and influential architects of our time. But throughout the years, some of those projects never made it across the finish line. Some were shelved at the concept stages, and some were cancelled just as construction was beginning to ramp up. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this episode of Cancelled, I'm gonna revisit a topic I covered long ago in an abandoned episode, share some rarely seen concepts, and take a look at some of Walt Disney World's never-built hotels. It all starts with what essentially was the modern-day creation of Walt Disney World. This includes a relatively small portion of their overall plot of land in Central Florida. And today, you'll see the formation of two main lakes, the natural body of water, Bay Lake, and the man-made Seven Seas Lagoon. The Magic Kingdom, most of the hotels, and the Kingdom's monorail line runs around this area. But long ago, with Roy Disney leading the company, the first few concepts for the Vacation Kingdom looked quite a bit different. In the late 1960s, a few models and overall master plans were crafted, and in this 1968 model where things look so foreign to how they do today, some resorts like the Contemporary are familiar. Others not so much and are more nondescript, with a lagoon shaped quite differently than how things would later build out. By 1969, the general idea for Walt Disney World's Phase 1 had been locked down. Bay Lake and Seven Seas Lagoon were going to be the two central masses of water in which these resorts would be placed on the shores of. But in early plans, Seven Seas Lagoon would actually be expanded to the west. Later master concepts would just outline this area and label it under future lagoon expansion. Though, of course, this would never happen. By 1970, the master plan had more or less been decided upon, and when it was locked in place, this is what was shown to the public at the Walt Disney World Preview Center, which at its core would feature a 600 square foot model of the entire site. In this plan, the concept showed the intended full build-out of Phase 1 for Walt Disney World, with the Magic Kingdom, a golf course, the Contemporary Resort, a campground, and the Polynesian Resort, which at this stage had a tower, though this would later be scaled back by the time shovels went into the ground. But that wasn't all that was in store here. You'll notice that another 3 resorts were planned for this area. All of these ended up on marketing material and were featured prominently on the models and even on promotional films.
Perhaps lunch on the way at the new Disney-designed and Disney-managed Asian Hotel.
This is Disney's Asian Resort, and upon the opening of Walt Disney World in 1971, it was set to be the next project slated for construction in the remaining 5-year period of Phase 1. This property was slated to hold over 600 guest rooms and have a towering 160-foot-high lobby structure that would also feature an observation lounge at the top. The guest room structure would border the property with a large courtyard and swimming pool in the middle. Concept art depicts a lush waterfront with authentic Southeast Asian-inspired architecture. The plot of land that this resort was designed to occupy was slated to be rectangular, so during the construction and dredging of Seven Seas Lagoon, a rectangular peninsula was left undeveloped, seemingly an obvious sign of what was to come. The Asian Resort was far along in its design, and with a nearby road already named Asian Way, the company confirmed its imminent construction, stating in their 1972 annual report that construction would begin in 1974 and open later that year. This aggressive opening schedule made sense too, since in their same annual report, the company claimed they were turning away an average of 1,100 room requests a day due to demand, and that the existing 2 hotels on property were operating at nearly max capacity. The resort was even mentioned on the 1972 monorail narration as you passed by the future plot of land.
The large neck of land jutting out into the water is the site for another exciting resort being planned for the near future based on an exotic Asian theme.
By the next year, however, the 1973 oil crisis struck America, and thus tourism, especially car-based tourism, had declined dramatically. Suddenly, the extra inventory of hotel rooms were no longer needed, And while internal timeline documents at Disney stated the resort would be pushed until March 1975, the reality was that the project would just be put on hold. The only other mention of the resort would come in 1980, when a model was put up in the post-show at the Walt Disney Story attraction in Magic Kingdom. This model showed the Asian resort in an updated form, with a green roof, a split lodging structure, and an extended beach. To my knowledge, this seemingly updated plan was never publicly released in any written form, and this new plan for the hotel was likely very short-lived, as its budget was then likely absorbed into the Epcot Center project, along with its viability for a future. Ultimately, an outside CEO was brought into the company in 1984. Him being Michael Eisner, along with Frank Wells to serve as president. Eisner had a personal interest in architecture and saw the value in what a physical space meant to stand for decades means to an environment. So, with the encouragement from major shareholders, the company began development of a premium flagship resort poised to be, spoiler alert, the first resort to be built since 1971. When Eisner came in, he created the Disney Development Corporation, or DDC, in 1984. The DDC was an arm of the company divided away from Imagineering and was responsible for all development projects outside of the parks. So they were tasked to create this new resort along with architects from WATG. Eisner sat in on several meetings, taking an interest on even the smallest aspects of the project, like picking out wallpaper and bedsheets. They ultimately landed on a concept that had been on the drawing boards for a number of years. A quaint Victorian-themed hotel slated to have private cottages on the secluded islands within Seven Seas Lagoon, though that aspect of the resort would later be scrapped. All of this would eventually evolve into something much bigger. And with the former Asian site now selected, Disney's Grand Floridian Beach Resort would open in June 1988. While this new hotel ended up occupying the land slated for the Asian resort, there were still 2 other plots of land for Phase 1 of Walt Disney World.
This one will be a vision out of the Arabian Nights, the Persian Hotel, a veritable palace on the hotel keeper's art.
Disney's Persian resort was slated to be developed east of the Magic Kingdom. It too was very architecturally distinct, with a massive center lobby building and radiating guest rooms around it. Pitched as a luscious Far Eastern palace, this 500-room property would also curiously be on the monorail line. Now, some of the early designs for the Magic Kingdom called for a monorail line to run right through Tomorrowland like it does in California. But the final plans ultimately eliminated this, and the monorail loop, like we know it today, stands. What's interesting though is that despite the monorail line fundamentally changing shape, the Persian land was still considered a future hotel expansion site. But just like the Asian resort, the 1973 oil crisis had put a halt to these plans. Presumably, if it had been built, the existing monorail maintenance line could be reformatted and a hotel could make sense. But while the land was cleared, the site was being used for equipment and material staging. Supposedly in 1978, Disney was in talks with the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who took a personal interest in funding the hotel. However, this was kind of during the Iranian Revolution, and these talks fell through 2 years before his death. So due to its proximity to back-of-house areas, maintenance facilities, and a lack of infrastructure, the site will likely never be used for hospitality purposes, and it sits today as a cast member parking area and equipment staging site. Phase 1 of the master plan would have been topped off with a 5th hotel on property, and that would have been the Venetian.
This one is a bit of Venice and St. Mark's Square. Venetian throughout in design and decor.
500 rooms would have made up this very unique resort. Perched on the shores of Seven Seas Lagoon in between Contemporary and the Transportation and Ticket Center, also on the monorail line, this resort would have brought the canals of Venice, Italy to Florida. Now, the lobby structure here is admittedly pretty weird and not very well themed. More of a design choice to increase the number of hotel rooms and somewhat indicative of 1970s architecture. But the outer buildings would have made up narrow channels where guests could take gondola rides and gawk at the recreation of St. Mark's Square, complete with a 120-foot replica of the Campanelli Tower. But just like the others, the oil crisis shelved plans here and wouldn't be looked at again for a few decades. But before we get to that, let's take a trip over and across the water bridge to Bay Lake. Fort Wilderness Campground was originally supposed to be much further to the west to where it was actually built. Land was being cleared in this area back in the 70s when the whole resort was under construction, but it's kind of unclear why. Now, when Epcot Center was under construction, Disney's then CEO, Card Walker, had acknowledged the resort's need for additional lodging. So in 1981, this mysterious site that was cleared finally got an announcement. Cypress Point Lodge was proposed as a quaint 550 hotel resort made up of 3 lodging buildings and 50 cabins. It was themed to be a smaller and more relaxed resort, with wooden columns and stone chimneys, nodding to the architecture of the lodges of the Great West. This was announced with another 2 resorts, those being Grand Floridian and the Mediterranean. Now again, this was during the Card Walker administration at the company, and these 3 hotel projects were being shuffled around in development over the next few years. In the end, none of them got off the ground during this era, while Disney was still dealing with the Epcot budget overruns and corporate hostile takeovers. But when Michael Eisner came in and the drama at corporate finally died down, he tasked the newly formed Disney Development Corporation to revisit these ideas with famous architects. Peter Dominick from 4240 Architecture was brought in, along with WED and DDC, to reevaluate the Cypress Point idea. Dominick was well known for designing authentic mountain lodge architecture, and over the next few years, Cypress Point had been completely redesigned into a brand new, much larger resort called Wilderness Lodge. This property would ultimately open in 1994 on the same plot of land. It was designed in tandem with another moderate resort meant to occupy the shoreline of Fort Wilderness Campground, though it never saw construction. I've talked about that resort in quite a lot of detail already, so if you're interested in learning more about it, I'll link my River Country video below. The third hotel from that era follows suit with this trend. With an appetite for even more premium hotel rooms, the previously announced Mediterranean-themed hotel was also being pursued by the DDC. They hired esteemed architect Antoine Predock, someone known for straying away from conventional architecture and to structures evocative of a certain time or place. So in 1989, he began initial drawings for this new resort, slated to occupy the plot of land where the Venetian was proposed back in the early 70s. Working alongside the DDC, Predock crafted a stunning 1,000-room hotel and convention center, and at its core, designed to be a structure never really attempted in North America. Its striking white exterior was quoted as being not a literal extrapolation of Mediterranean architecture, but as an abstract interpretation of it. But comfort and logistics wouldn't be hindered from this, as the resort would feature all the modern amenities and be a short monorail ride away from everything. The resort would be filled with lush gardens and courtyards, along with a dynamic main pool area. Since the plot of land was on Seven Seas Lagoon and close to the Magic Kingdom, the main structure would be angled towards the park, with a large amphitheater-like viewing platform at the top for firework viewing. Fragments of architectural ruin would trail into the lake, posing an ancient and ambiguous setting. Truly, this was a brilliant plan, diverting from the norm in hotel design and crafting a real marvel of architecture. Ultimately, this hotel was announced in 1990, just as Eisner approved the hotel internally. As plans were finalized, the development arm got to work, eventually awarding a contractor and starting the site preparations. Soil was brought in from the recently dredged rivers of the Dixie Landings Resort. That fill was brought to the site in 1991, just as the land was being prepared for pilings and foundation work. This was a serious project, even showing up on employee maps and appearing by name in multiple copies in the press. By this time, it was late in the year, and serious construction was imminent. But then Disney was beginning to get cold feet. The Gulf War had been going on for the last 2 years, and executives at the resort were getting worried about the effects it might have on the economy, as well as tourists' appetite for a new 5-star hotel. Besides the proposed 1,000 rooms they would need to fill, it also played heavily on the convention market, which the company was still unsure about after adding additional square footage at other resorts. By the end of 1991, the company had pulled the plug and canceled the hotel. Although, interestingly, the resort was still being mentioned after its death, curiously showing up in master plans from the Urban Design Group, as well as other internal concept plans. It was even being mentioned by large publications like the Miami Herald all the way up to 1994, 3 years after its official cancellation. Whatever the case may be, the site wouldn't be left there for long. In fact, Disney was ready to take a second look at building a clean sheet design for a new 5-star hotel within the decade. So in 1999, WATG were brought back to dream up just that, but this time to revive a long-dead idea from the 1970s, an Italian-inspired hotel. That's right, the Disney Development Corporation, which had now been merged into Imagineering, along with WATG, were going to bring back the Venetian, over 30 years since it was first conceived. This new resort was going to be called Disney's Grand Venezia Resort. Much like the original Venetian concept and returning to replicating historical architecture, this property would draw inspiration from the urban waterscapes of Venice. Now, this hotel would have been a true 5-star hotel property, the next flagship hotel in Walt Disney World's growing roster of resorts. And it's easy to see why, as this structure would have been highly themed, with small canals winding through the property, essentially creating 2 islands, both with lush pool areas and gardens. Ornate fountains would greet you as you drive under both stone archways and a monorail, likely departing from the hotel's very own station. With a convention center and a wedding pavilion, the property was poised to be a winner with both guests and corporate. The idea obviously made it to the conceptual phase, and even the first few drafts of schematics. However, Disney's strategic planning group, the division meant to identify a project's economic viability, ultimately considered this as an unlikely candidate for corporate approval. And thus, the project was shelved by the dawn of the millennium. By now, the years of Michael Eisner overseeing all aspects of design were long over. The Euro Disneyland disaster and the soon-to-be distrust in the CEO from shareholders caused him to turn away from heavy spending in the resorts, and left little time for him to champion the projects he loved. Very few capital-intensive projects got approved thereafter. For instance, another little-known project was being developed with famous architect Cesar Pelli, who's best known for the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. He designed the Hollywood Hotel, planned to go at the west entrance of MGM Studios, so likely in this area. It was designed as a massive 1,500 plus room hotel and convention resort, themed as an Art Deco tower of Hollywood's past. His influence in these concepts can definitely be seen, but like other projects in the early 2000s, it never made it past the drawing board. Ultimately, Eisner would be pushed out of the company, and it seems that he brought his desire to build architecturally striking hotels with him. Eisner's successors just didn't have the same love for design that he advocated for. There were some other projects that don't necessarily deserve a large amount of thought on, particularly a few DVC resorts that never got past the finish line, like Eagle Pines. With Bob Iger and a very brief tenure of Bob Chapek leading Disney, the company kept a tighter lid on what they announced. But of course, some things do slip, like the 2 resorts that were meant to replace the abandoned River Country water park. Again, my seemingly endless coverage of the chronicles of Disney's River Country is a great place to get more details. But most recently has been the cancellation of the Reflections resort there. Unlike all of these other projects, the Reflections property was heavily promoted and actually got pilings and the foundations in the ground before it was abruptly canceled. It took a massive economic shift from the pandemic to put a stop to the project. The site has now effectively been abandoned once again, with pilings still visible through the quickly growing Florida brush. Reflections was interestingly yet another property designed by WATG. Now, the firm has obviously changed since the 1970s, with many of the original architects now long gone, and they now seem to be following exactly what Disney tells them to design. And Disney themselves seem to have changed philosophy quite drastically. The emphasis through the 70s, but definitely through the mid-1980s and 90s, was the importance of good design. It was championed by Eisner and delivered on by Imagineering and the Disney Development Corporation. Famous architects came in and designed some truly fantastic resorts, done their way with the collaboration of the creatives at Disney. The result was, in my opinion, some of the greatest modern-day hotels ever built in North America. I think there's even an argument to say in the entire world. But it's also interesting to see the ones that never made it. But the very fact of their existence compared to what is greenlit today is a pretty crazy leap. I think the best example of that is the Mediterranean. Antoine Preda created a really cool-looking interpretation of what a Greece-inspired hotel could look like. It was a thoughtful resort, and one that I think looks beautiful. But then you compare it to the new Riviera Resort, which follows a similar core design theme. I think the differences really speak for themselves. On top of that, it's hard to wrap your head around the budgets for modern day projects as well. It's been talked to death about, but the fact Disney can greenlight something like the Galactic Starcruiser and call it an entire loss after less than 2 years is insane, where something like the Mediterranean or the Grand Venezia would have been an instant classic hotel for Disney. It would have been a slam dunk in the grand scheme of things, just like Grand Floridian is today, commanding some of the highest prices in all of Florida. Still though, a lot did come from this era, and most of the architects and designers who did work on these projects got to see some of their plans come to fruition. Predock even saw the completion of the Hotel Santa Fe, which he and the DDC designed for Euro Disneyland. So I am very thankful that we do get to enjoy the projects that did come to fruition. And really learning about the never-built projects puts into perspective on how much work goes into each concept, so it's even more devastating when they don't happen. Sites are cleared and publicly promised, only to never make it. The Venetian land alone has had 3 serious proposals, with construction even starting in one, yet the land is still vacant today. It stands really as the last plot of land that has yet to be built upon from the Phase 1 vision all the way back in 1970. It's a long ladder of geotechnical studies, conceptual ideas, design prep, master planning, budgeting, contracting. There's just an enormous amount that goes into these projects. It's incredibly fascinating to me, and it's why I wanted to bring light to an era of the company and projects that not everyone might know about. It is pretty interesting that everyone who loves Disney now has that affinity because of what was built here before. So, the new initiatives by the company, such as announcing they will be deciding on what to invest in at the parks by the data they get from Disney Plus, seems very, very ill-advised. By that mentality, none of the classic resorts or even theme park attractions would have ever been built. Certainly not Grand Floridian or Wilderness Lodge, or even Contemporary and Polynesian. None of those are established intellectual properties to extrapolate misinformed data about. Back in the 80s and 90s, Disney was trying to be more than just a theme park complex. Eisner was interested in building hotels from some of the greatest architects of our time, without slapping Pocahontas dead center in the lobby. And sure, that's maybe because the egos of some of those architects prevented that from happening, but obviously that was a good decision in the long run. The end result for the ones we did get were some of the greatest examples of hotel theming ever. It's essentially what defines what a Disney hotel is. I don't think anyone can seriously claim that about modern properties like the Riviera. If anything, Disney is actively removing theming from the properties that set the standard. I think Wing Chow, who at the time was a senior vice president for the Disney Development Corporation, said it best in an interview for the Miami Herald in 1990. Quote, "We are not embarking on the evolution of architectural history, but in the last 5 years, well, these are buildings you won't forget."
If you haven't heard yet, I just launched my brand new merch store at shopbrightsonfilms.com. You can get my classic Brightson Films logo, or rep some more niche jokes of the channel. The coveted hat is also now back in stock. Also, as you may have noticed with this video, these projects take a lot of time and effort to produce. And if you're looking to support me outside of picking up my merch, you can visit my Patreon page to get a bunch of perks like behind the scenes content, early videos, your name at the end of this video, and Polaroid pictures. Visit patreon.com/brightsonfilms. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.